Alright, so you've created your world grid, you've set it up, you've configured it, you've set the data. Now it's time to move on to adding the components that the dynamic loading kit will use to function. Now in these videos, I'm just going to add the components one by one. The easiest way to actually go about adding components is to go to Game Object, Create Other, Dynamic Loading Kit, and choose one of these pre-configured game objects. And that'll provide you with a good starting point. In order to go over each of these components one by one, I'm just going to delete that and add the components one by one. In this video, I'll start with the persistent data controller. So for clarity's sake, I'm going to add each of these components to their own separate game object. As you saw though with that pre-configured game object, it's perfectly fine to stick all of your components on a single game object. So I'll call this persistent data controller. I'm going to go into component, dynamic loading kit, main components, and the only persistent data controller I've provided by default is the PlayerPress persistent data controller. This controller uses the PlayerPress to save the persistent data between sessions. You can create your own custom type that uses a different saving strategy, for instance XML, serialization, or whatever, it doesn't matter. Even if you do create your own though, you'll see this scene ID field. So the first thing you want to change to something unique. You should only have one persistent data controller per scene, but you will have multiple persistent data controllers in different scenes if you have more than one scene. It's possible you might only have one persistent data controller in your entire project, in which case you really don't need to change this. But since we don't know whether we'll have multiple persistent data controllers, we'll go ahead and change this. We'll just make a video. And that's basically all you need to do. All these other options here are for clearing persistent data. So if you have some persistent data, and then in the editor you're like, well, I've changed some things around and I want to reset my dynamic loading kit. You can do that by choosing one of the clear methods. There's a lot of different ones you can clear. It's not really going to be clear what all these do right now. As I go through the additional components, you'll start seeing what all of these different things you can delete are. And you have the component manager ID, which you'll see later, and active grid ID. Some of these you don't need to specify. And you can also hover over each of these options to see exactly what they're doing. Just click on them and then hover over them. And then once you've chosen a clear option, you've entered the appropriate IDs if required. You hit clear data and you'll see a little message saying whether the clearing was successfully completed. Of course, I don't have any persistent data, so there was nothing to clear. You can also click this button here, clear all persistent scene data. This is going to clear all the data that is related to this single component, this specific instance of the PlayerPress persistent data controller. So you can kind of use that as a catch-all. If you don't want to worry about clearing specific stuff, you just want to clear everything, you can use this button. Just be careful. Okay, and that'll conclude this video. We've got our PlayerPress persistent data controller component set up. And in the next video, we'll cover setting up the world component.